Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. 10 days ago, as the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham offensive began from Idlib, taking over Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, I did an episode to try and analyze what was going on. Even at that early stage, some facts were becoming clear. The anti-Russia and anti-Iran external state actors had got into action. More than Russia, which had already reduced its presence in Syria, the window was with reference to Iran and Hezbollah, weakened because of a year-long war with Israel and focused on their own respective security spaces. Into this space entered Turkey, the United States, and Israel. And we're going to discuss that. How? Now, HTS designated a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, and also, irony of ironies, Turkey was on the move freely as Bashar al-Assad's Syrian Arab army folded and in many cases simply melted away. Its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, is a nom de guerre of Ahmad Hussein al-Shara. We also don't know whether Ahmad Hussein al-Shara is a genuine name, but he's definitely a shadowy character who still has a $10 million bounty on him, was out in the open giving interviews to Western media, including CNN. HTS advancing vehicles were moving openly on the main highway with no air support. And what does that mean? It means that they could have been taken out by anyone operating air sorties for ground attacks. And why do I mention this? To establish some basic facts. Military offensives require lengthy and detailed preparations, developing a plan through advanced intelligence, concentrating forces, working out logistics, etc., etc. Offensives are not about a body of men getting up one day and moving from point A to B. They require complex planning, and execution depends on sustainment. One of the questions we discussed last time was about the timing, and a simple question. How is it that the United States and also its Western allies and Israeli intelligence did not pick up this activity? And the answer was because they did not want to. They knew this offensive was coming because it was and remains part of the biggest strategic game they were and are playing. Now, the question is, how is it that Jawlani has shown no fear of being taken out by the US aerial attacks, a standard US counterterrorism policy? How is it that the US Warthog ground attack aircraft let long exposed HTS convoys move on M4 without taking them out, as they would force concentrations of any FTO, while strafing Iraqi militia reinforcements coming into Syria to help us? Answer, prima facie, because the US and Israel are in on the bigger game in which HTS is a pawn and Assad was to be expended. The same question obviously can also be asked with reference to Ankara, which is normally very adept at attacking those who it considers terrorists. Now, since our last program, Assad has fled, and HTS and its affiliated groups are in control of Damascus. A transitional government has been formed with Mohammed al-Bashir as prime minister. Bashir previously ran an administration in Idlib under the control of HTS. For its part, Israel has moved into the demilitarized buffer zone established in 1974 and claims the agreement is void because of the collapse of Assad's regime. It has also occupied Mount Hermon on the Syrian side, and actually, what exactly does it mean? It means that physically, it can strike Damascus with medium-range artillery, not even long-range. It has also flown more than 500 sorties until last Tuesday, destroying air bases, naval assets, weapons depots, and other military infrastructure. There's much else, but let's take the questions to the same panel I had when I discussed Syria last time. Caroline Rose is the director of the Strategic Blind Spots Portfolio at the New Lines Institute, where she leads and produces research on the intersection of defense, security, illicit trades, and geopolitical landscapes from Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. Leila Hatoum, who's an international law expert, political economist, longtime war correspondent, and editor-in-chief of MENA Uncensored. So welcome back to the program. A lot has changed since we spoke last time. I think as I was talking to Caroline just before the program off camera, I think Turkey was also completely taken aback by the speed with which Assad's forces just collapsed. So, Caroline, what do you make of this now? I mean, there is a transitional government, and the situation on the ground is that the Israelis have moved into the southwest of Syria. The Turkish military, which was already kind of from the northwest to right up to the entire belt towards north, obviously has its buffer zones. The SDF is where it is, and basically the area which was controlled by Assad is now under the control of HTS and its affiliates.
Certainly.
Is this additional government going to be an entity which can put together something, or are we looking at more instability?
Thank you so much for having me on once again. I think that ultimately when we're looking at what's to come with this new transitional government, I think that, when we look at how HTS will govern, there are a number of unknowns. I think that right now we've already seen the Salvation government convene a few different meetings with some existing Syrian regime, Assad regime ministers and key heads. Additionally, I think that it's also very clear that now Turkey and Israel are certainly trying to make their own offensives and carve out their own areas of influence inside of Syria. With Turkey in the northeast, there's a possibility that they could push beyond Manbij. And of course, with Israel moving beyond the Golan and quite fast. That is an offensive that is fast-paced, and of course also trying to identify and target former regime military assets such as bases in Tartus and Latakia, and essentially eliminate military assets that are in the region.
Yeah. So Leila, you and I spoke about this on the program also, and we've been talking about this bilaterally also. Israel now has a huge space. When Erdogan says, and when Turkey says, and the Turkish foreign minister says, oh, what Israel is doing is absolutely illegal. Frankly, it's like butter won't melt in their mouths, because what did they think would happen? When they basically uproot the Assad regime, there's going to be a vacuum. And into that vacuum would march in Israel. Although the United Nations has already condemned the Israeli occupation of the demilitarized zone, but frankly, I know that doesn't make any difference to Israel. The UK, the United States, and US allies have already said, and the statements are on record, that Israel has a right to self-defense, and what Israel is doing is perfectly fine. So Israel has been taking out whatever little military capability was left. As I said in my opening, naval assets, air bases, ammunition, other depots, and the rest of it. Now, it seems to me that the Israelis are not going to go back, because if the situation in Syria, as I fear, would happen, if it slides further, then we are going to have a Balkanization of the country. Do you agree with that?
Well, think about it this way. Whatever the Turks say, or the Qataris say, or the Americans say, they're just trying to take off the blame off their backs. They knew what was going to happen because they are part of this whole game. They've seen what happened in Libya. They've seen what happened in Iraq. And they've seen what happened shortly or momentarily after basically Hosni Mubarak was toppled as well. So they are bound. They're not that stupid. They're bound to know that when you take off Assad in that manner, when you have over 30 terrorist groups and radical groups and internal groups basically armed to the teeth, fighting on the ground, you're not only going to have a vacuum in power, but also a fight over the power and power positions across the areas in Syria. So no matter what they bring into power or what they do, nothing is going to stop the situation from deteriorating inside Syria. So what do they do best is like trying to absolve themselves in front of the international community. We didn't know. We were trying just to topple a dictator. We had nothing to do with these people on the ground. But who facilitated the movement of the terrorists into Syria? Wasn't it Turkey? Who actually sent its troops and created what you call military bases, active military bases in Syria, especially in Idlib, and later on now in Aleppo. And they're moving on towards PKK. Who is bombarding Syria, left, right, and center for the past 14 months and more, for the past 14 years? The Israelis. And the Americans, they have illegal military bases, over 34 of them across Syria, including 2 main ones in Atanaf and Konoko. So if you're banking on any solution coming from those sides are the reason why Syria is facing what it's facing. And they will not succeed in doing anything, because the moment you let the genie out of the bottle, you can control the people you sent, but the people under them, there's bound to be at least 10 terrorists who will go rogue and who will create problems not only to the Syrians, but it will also filter through to other borders, neighboring borders in countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey as well. So the Turks are afraid of that. They knew the situation, but they, as you said, they didn't know the scale and the speed with which Assad was going to hand over indeed.
Okay, a follow-up question, Leila, which I also want to carry to Caroline. So there's obviously, Turkey was tacitly part of this because, and I know that you're so fond of maps and you read them so well. If you look at where HTS was operating in Idlib, it is quite clear that there's absolutely no way that they could have the lines of communication, both for civilian governance as well as their military capability, without the tacit approval of Turkey, which controls just area north of Idlib. So there's no doubt about that. However, what about the SDF, the YPG, the PKK? Those are the groups that the United States supports, specifically with reference to ISIS. And those are the groups that Turkey obviously considers as terrorist organizations. Do you think there's going to be a recalibration of this policy by Ankara and by Washington? And we also have to, and that's what I want to ask Caroline, with the incoming administration, how that's going to work out.
There's always a recalibration even on an hourly basis because of the speed with which the developments are happening on the ground in Syria. But when it comes to the terrorist groups that you just mentioned, HTS is also a terrorist group. It's headed by a terrorist, as you mentioned, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, or whatever his name is. There is still a bounty of $10 million on his head, and you rightfully so pointed that out. The Turks have an issue with the PKK, which are the Kurds. We have to explain to people, because not everybody knows the abbreviations. SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces that are supported by the Americans, and they mainly operate northeast and eastern side of Syria, alongside the same lines with the ISIS. ISIS operates over there. They are supported indirectly by the Americans, and they operate anywhere between Deir ez-Zor and Bukamal. So that's basically Central East Syria, all the way down to what you call the borders with Iraq. That's why the Iraqis are also afraid of what might happen and the developments happening on the ground. And then you have the YPJ, PKK, etc., northeast and partially northwest of Syria, but mainly in northeast. Those are the areas that were hit and bombarded by the Israelis over the past week. They hit Qamishli and around it, and not because they are trying to destroy Syrian armed groups' defenses. That area is well supported by the Americans. It's to give the Kurds an excuse to actually fortify their presence and carve away that part of the territory, Syrian territory, into their Kurdish state, as they call it. And this is what the Turks are afraid of. So they're monitoring the situation with caution. They're sending more troops, not only from the northern side of Syria, but northwest side of Syria. Remember, Idlib is not only supported by the borders from North Syria, but also from northwest, because you have at one point the triangle, as we mentioned, that's closer to the Turkish border. That's Tel Rifat, Azaz, basically. And then you have the other borders of Idlib that are also closer to the Turkish borders from the seaside. So the Turks can control that corner, which is northwest to central North Syria. However, when you're talking about northeast, that's mainly PKK, and that's where the main worry for the Kurds are. So they are recalibrating. For Washington, they don't give a damn. The more the situation is chaotic, the more that they keep their troops on the ground, and they mentioned it recently. They mentioned two critical things that people basically took lightly. The first one is that they have already accepted the annexation of Golan Heights by the Israelis, which means they already carved out an internationally acknowledged Syrian territory. All the way they gave it to the Israelis. And the other part is that they will not pull out their troops so long that the situation is chaotic. They need to help with the peacekeeping in Syria, which means their illegal presence will continue. And that's another occupation. The Washington, having its troops on the ground, they don't want to lose them. So they are going to monitor the situation and recalibrate based on that.
Right. Caroline, how do you look at the situation? And the same question to you.
Certainly. Well, I actually disagree and think that for the United States, the goal and the objective is actually to withdraw their forces. There's about a contingent of 900 active duty personnel on the ground in Syria that does not account for contractors. And really, I think that we've already seen this slightly with Iraq, but we're going to immediately see this in Syria, particularly when Trump comes into office. Right now, within the United States, there is a lot of skepticism and critique about the value that this particular deployment and this mission in northern Syria delivers for American interests. And despite an uptick in ISIS attacks that we've seen in recent years, particularly in the last 2 years in northeast Syria, as well as, of course, the body of Syria, still there is this narrative that ISIS is defeated. So because of that, there is a central tension within the United States, within Washington, that has created an incentive to try and withdraw slowly from northeast Syria. We've seen a number of congressional attempts inside of the U.S. Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, that tried to withdraw U.S. forces in a span of just a few weeks. And then, of course, there was another attempt to withdraw U.S. forces within a span of about 2 to 3 months. These attempts did fail, especially in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal. And so because of that, we've had a Biden administration that has struggled to grapple with how it can orient its posture in northeast Syria, and then likely a Trump administration that will seek to completely withdraw from northeast Syria. And we saw that reflected in Trump's recent statement, his first statement in addressing the recent events in Syria. The last sentence, he said that we shouldn't be there in the first place. And so because of that, we'll seek to withdraw. And so when it comes to how the United States is watching and observing this Turkish offensive, likely that would be pushed beyond Manbij, it is, of course, concerned about a few things. Number one would be the stability and security of ISIS detention centers, which have hung by a thread for the last few years. And of course, whenever there is an offensive, whether it's an aerial offensive or a ground offensive, or even the threat of an operation conducted by Turkey, typically the SDF, they get distracted, they deploy more forces to the front. And because of that, then these detention centers are quite fragile. So that is, of course, the United States' first and top concern. The second, of course, is any sort of attempt by ISIS to reconstitute, recruit forces at camps like Al-Hol, also conduct low-level insurgencies, low-level attacks on checkpoints as they try and take this opportunity of distraction, both amongst local communities as well as, of course, with SDF forces. And then finally, and this isn't necessarily stated in the mandate for Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the U.S. mission there, but of course, it's the concern about Iran. How will Iran-aligned militias try and take advantage of the very porous border along Syria and Iraq to try and take advantage of these different checkpoints. I think at this moment, we've seen an influx of regime forces as well as Iran-aligned militias retreat back into Iraq. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not operating in Syria, but I think that for the United States, the top two concerns right now is, it's the ISIS threat in both detention centers as well as recruitment. How the United States will try and defend these different interests, I think that's very unclear. I think, as my colleague just mentioned, I think that it's very clear that the United States is watching very closely and not necessarily making any sudden moves beyond the occasional strike against suspected ISIS cells and ISIS activity in the Badia. But I think that we are likely to see a swift withdrawal from northeast Syria February or potentially even in March, soon after the Trump administration takes office.
Okay, interesting. Now, assuming that the Trump administration does go for a US troop pullout, then because strategies can be pretty cynical, frankly. I remember I was in Kabul in 2019, was meeting with Karzai and Dawzai and many other Afghan leaders, and all of them were convinced that the United States has relocated ISIS to Afghanistan. So strategies can be pretty cynical. Now, the question is it possible that if the US pulls out the troops, in order to both checkmate Iran, as well as to create problems for YPG and PKK, that the Turkey forces actually begin to support ISIS? There was a time they were actually supporting ISIS against the Kurds, which is going to create a different kind of problem. I want to get your take and then also Leila's on this.
I think that if there is a swift U.S. withdrawal, and if you think about it, 900 forces, it's extremely small. It will not take that long to swiftly pull those forces out. I think that ultimately Turkey will certainly try and launch an aerial and ground offensive, pushing further into the northeast, creating that corridor that they've been trying to create for years, for the intention of repatriating Syrian communities back into Syria, but then also, of course, to create that buffer zone and that barrier between Turkey and Kurdish groups that are operating in the northeast. In terms of how Turkey will handle ISIS, I don't necessarily think that they would try and sponsor and assist and back resurgent ISIS cells. I think that ultimately they'll know that the ISIS threat is a primary concern, and any sort of negotiations and talks that are surrounding a U.S. withdrawal will really try and ensure that Turkey and Turkish-backed forces are trying to serve as a counterweight to the ISIS threat and the ISIS presence. I also think that it's very possible that the United States will try and enlist some other regional partners in the region. So, for example, Jordan, I think, will play also a very large role in this. And I think that the United States will really try and gear some sort of system and a mechanism in wake of its withdrawal process.
Like something to help with over-the-horizon counterterrorism capabilities?
Certainly, I think that that will definitely be an emphasis for the United States, trying to conduct more over-the-horizon analysis of terrorist organizations that are operating in the region. But when it comes to how the United States will gear this, I'm not necessarily certain. Beyond beyond Jordan and beyond Turkey, I think that as of now, those are the two very obvious partners that the United States will try and coordinate. It's also possible that they'll try and coordinate with Israel. And as we've been seeing,
they're already coordinating with Israel. I mean, they're cheek by jowl, frankly. I mean, Israel won't be getting into the demilitarized zone and bombing everything in Syria that moves without U.S. tacit approval. But Leila, what do you think of the situation with reference to a possible or potential or putative US troop pullout?
I highly doubt that they will pull out, even if Trump comes in. Remember, they said the same thing about Iraq, and we still have one of the largest bases, Ain Amenas in Iraq, and that's filled with troops over there. There's also the issue of Donald Trump claiming in the past he wanted to pull out the troops from Syria, and then who bombarded Syria at the time? It was Donald Trump. The number of active US personnel on the ground is different than what the Pentagon or Central Command actually speaks of. We have solid information on the ground that the number of troops is over 1,500, not 900. And that does not include basically the civilians or the contractors or anything else. We're talking about actual troops on the ground. And they're divided not only in the southern side or basically on the eastern side, but also northeastern side. I don't think at any point in the near future the Americans would withdraw from PKK land because they do support the Kurds, unless something changes on the ground and they have an agreement with the Kurds where the Kurds take over that piece of land and they turn it into their own state or their own buffer zone. And Americans ensure that whatever happens, the Israelis will be helping out, even by Air Force or whatever the situation is. When it comes to ISIS, we've seen them in the past. They rarely attack American soldiers in Deir ez-Zor or basically in Konoko. That's eastern and central eastern part of Syria. But the ones who were attacking in the past, the Americans, were the tribes that were allied with Assad. Those will go rogue going forward because Assad is not there, nobody's there to reign them. And we expect them not only to attack American troops, but any foreign troops on the ground out of revenge or basically out of greed or power grab when it comes to territories. That leaves us with two possibilities for the Americans: either increase the number of troops on the ground or collaborate, as basically Caroline said, with other nations, basically like Jordan and others. I highly doubt that the Jordanians will agree to an active role inside Syria because that's suicide for them, especially with the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria would be filtering through to Jordan to join the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan to topple the king's reign. And remember, they were the ones behind most of the demonstrations over there. And their plan is to take over also Jordan. They never shied away from saying so. There's a newly agreed upon NATO base in Jordan. And I do believe that that NATO base that was approved in June would be playing an active role in terms of what's happening in Syria. And that's how Jordan will be part of it, but not actively on the ground.
Okay, here's an interesting tidbit. On 11th November, when Gideon Sa'ar took over from Yoav Gallant, he made a statement about reaching out to the Kurds and the Druze. And he said that they are Israel's natural allies. Now, it's an interesting statement because on the one hand, one can dismiss it as mere rhetoric. On the other hand, if you begin to kind of look at it as a piece in the larger mosaic and you try to fit it into that mosaic, you realize that maybe there is something unfolding there in the shadows. Which again is something that's not incredible. We know how Mossad operates. We know Israeli assassination policy, and it's not me saying this. Ronan Bergman wrote an entire monograph on that, Rise and Kill First. And all of that is, perfectly legit from the point of view of a state that assumes that it is defending itself. So it seems to me that there are still many small moving parts that could be coming into play in this entire situation. Leila, you go first, and then I want Caroline to comment on this.
Well, who is not going to be basically part of what's happening in Syria? If you don't take a part of it now, it's going to come to you afterwards. So I do believe that a lot of nations, a lot of entities will be taking part in terms of what's happening on the ground. When it comes to the Israelis, they've been active since day one. If you just believe that the Israelis only use Air Force or advancing through the border lines or disengagement lines, as they call them, towards another country, and that's the only active thing that the Israelis do, that's hilarious. At the end of the day, remember, in the past, we're not going to talk about Gideon Sa'ar. Gideon Sa'ar is basically devil incarnate to us over here. We've been monitoring him for the longest time, even before he became the minister. So this person actually is a master when it comes to covert operations or approving them. Remember, the Israelis in the past, they nearly had a president for Syria that's originally a Mossad agent. Covert operations. Eli Cohen. right? That what doesn't it's like what tells us that they don't have more of Eli Cohens inside the Syrian territories. And at the end of the day, over the past 14 years, it has been no man's land because the terrorists had controlled so many areas. They can produce their own official papers. Now they've taken across all of Syria. They have taken the passports control, the borders control, the civil service basically centers. They can produce their own documents, falsify anything you want, background for anybody they want to insert, and they will be part of there. At the end of the day, we do believe that there's a high level of cooperation between them. We've heard not only as HTS, but also SDF saying that they want peace with the Israelis, good relations with the Israelis. That means they have infiltrated long time ago, and they have people who had worked inside to create that atmosphere and create that kind of need to have peace with the Israelis. So
this is being reported by the Israeli media. I mean, I was monitoring Times of Israel and Jerusalem Post, and and also Channel 12, the Israeli Channel 12. What do you think of this, Caroline?
Certainly. Well, I think that Israel is looking at this moment as a key opportunity to try and push beyond as much as they can beyond the Golan Heights, try and create this so-called buffer zone. And while Netanyahu put the statement out and said that essentially this operation was a way of showing the transitional government that that they would not tolerate it making alliances with Iran and Iran-aligned militias, I think ultimately what this is really about is ensuring that Syria, no matter what structure of governance it is under, and whatever umbrella organization that is in the reins in Damascus, that Syria is weakened. And that, I think, explains why Israel has conducted and has targeted from the outset these strikes against regime military bases. We saw the Maza air base, we saw Latakia, we saw Tartus, we saw the entire naval fleet, as decrepit as it was, targeted by IDF strikes. And now also we're seeing this paired with a territorial offensive beyond the Golan. And I think that this is because, Israel wants its neighbor Syria to be fragmented. It doesn't necessarily want to see a unified Syria. While, of course, Turkey is doing the job of, I think, throwing a wrench into the momentum that has been seized from Aleppo all the way to Damascus by creating some clashes and engaging against Kurdish forces in the northeast. I think Israel, of course, is now seeking out its own territorial offensive in the south. And I think because of this does create distraction with this new salvation government and the transitional government. I think this does create distraction for new governance and what that new governance will look like. And so because of that, I think that Israel is achieving this objective. I don't think it's been about Iran and Iran-aligned militias. I think this is about just Syria as a whole and how Syria plays into the greater geopolitics and the strategy that Israel has in the region.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I agree with her that the Israelis want to weaken Syria. That's the end game. Weaken it until they take over. But the push for the ground offensive has not only basically been limited to, let's say, a buffer zone. They have reached less than 20 kilometers from Damascus. And as you said, they've taken over Mount Hermon. They can bombard Damascus from a high position. And you know how important it is when it comes to military to gain high land because you have access and basically you uncover everything in front of you. But also they can bombard deep inside the southern Lebanon and Bekaa area from there. Having said that, the Israeli endgame is Greater Israel, which Caroline pointed out, they want all of Syria. And they destroyed the military infrastructure, as I've said it before, the military infrastructure for the Syrian state. So when these power grab fights erupt between the terrorist groups on the ground across Syria, and be it in the north or at the eastern side or the western side or even down south, there's no single army, unified army with enough capabilities and an air force to actually stop them or deter part of them. Air force is very important. That's why they first attacked the air bases. They shut down the helicopters. Basically, they burned them on the ground, on the tarmac. Their Russian-made planes were burned, and then the fleet. No matter how weak it is, the fleet, but at least they can use it from the sea. That's also destroyed. It will take years, if not decades, to actually rebuild that capability, and at the same time to have a unified army. And that's the sad part.
This is classic salami slicing. Even if uh, we were to discount that they want to conquer the entire Syrian territory, which will obviously have its own major headaches, the fact is that they have reached the point from where they're not going to withdraw, because there'll be a clear excuse that the situation in Syria is unstable, and therefore, in self defense, we are going to have a forward defense against that. And then, as the situation further deteriorates, they are going to further advance into areas, occupy certain areas, and they're going to do that. But here's another thing, Caroline. The thing is that whatever Turkey has done, and I think what they've done is a terrible disservice, frankly, to the axis of resistance, in the sense of a kind of, lid against Israeli Zionism and settler colonialism, frankly, if you ask me. But quite apart from that, now they have the opportunity, because the western pier of the land bridge between Iran and Lebanon has been taken out. So there is no physical link up with Hezbollah. And unless Iran can do something with reference to a link up some way, which obviously will be from the seaside, and which will obviously be closely monitored by the Israeli Navy. But nonetheless, unless they can do something about it, Hezbollah will not get replenished. The Israelis will slowly, through their intelligence networks, keep trying to degrade Hezbollah leadership and defenses, and frankly try to go right up to the south of Litani River and push everyone north of that, and also take over certain parts of the Bekaa Valley. So this is going to be the defensive ring, if you will, which they will seek to create around themselves. And obviously, we know that once the Israelis, regardless of their return of Sinai, which was a different ball game altogether, a different kind of agreement. Fact is, once they go and occupy a land, they don't retreat from there. Is this an analysis that you would generally agree with?
Well, I certainly think that right now, when we look at Iran-aligned militias, given the fact that there had been a flood of these organizations and these militant groups that went from Syria back into Iraq as the offensive pushed beyond Hama into Homs and then Damascus, I think that for now, what we're going to see is them try and reconstitute and gain a bit of momentum inside of Iraq. Iraq still stands as, I think, a strong extension of Iran and its proxy network and its strategy. They've got political influence there. They have several militias under the Hashid structure, the Popular Mobilization Forces. And then in addition to that, it seems that there have been some key elements of Syria's 4th Armored Division. For example, Maher al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's brother, who was the commander and the head of the 4th Armored Division, which was a very key ally, a key partner to Iran-aligned militia networks and Iran itself that were operating in Syria. I think that your question of, where do they go from here is a valid one, because I think Lebanon, of course, their capacity has been severely hit. In Syria, things are playing out minute by minute, and as Leila just mentioned, these forces are pushing into Damascus quite quickly on the outskirts of Damascus, and they also have the potential to try and consolidate some gains along the Mediterranean coast as well. And so because of that, I think that Iran and its networks know well enough that Syria, for right now, is not necessarily an easy landscape to consolidate leverage and influence in. And I think because of that, I'm not necessarily sure if they'll try and attempt to create this land bridge, the crescent. It's been called so many different names, but to try and establish that presence across the Mediterranean and reach the Mediterranean Sea for now. I think that really, what Iran is good at, it plays the long game. It tries to sow seeds of political support. It also, of course, complements that with military assistance and trying sending surrogate proxy forces to that region. And so because of this, I think that they are going to try and look at how they can achieve and create favorable conditions in the long term. But I think for now, Syria is off limits. Lebanon is crippled in many ways due to the fact that Hezbollah, their operational capacity has been hit severely. And so because of that, I think we'll see a lot of activity in Iraq.
Sorry, but still the one force standing between Lebanon surrender and the Israeli occupation forces is Hezbollah. They're still there because they're part of South Lebanon. They're not going anywhere, despite taking lots of hits. They're standing their ground. But my fear is that if there is no replenishment, then obviously over a period of time, their capabilities will be further degraded. But here's the thing, Caroline, before I go back to Leila. In real terms, the way things are configured in terms of power relations, in terms of geopolitics, if the Israeli Navy was to decide to blockade Latakia and Tartus naval bases, there will not be a squeak from anyone. And I'm not talking about Russia, and I'm not talking about Iran. I'm saying the US and its Western allies will say this is perfectly normal and also justified on the basis of the dangers. Because, for instance, one could mount this argument, the Iranians could possibly use these bases. Or any number of excuses can be made. So the situation as it stands and the way I'm observing it from where I stand, it seems to me that even more than Turkey, and Ankara thinks that it has won, and you can see it from Erdogan's body language. He seems to be really jubilant for having exposed the Palestinians, for having exposed the Lebanese, and ironically, having exposed the Syrians. But the fact is that the Israelis will be supported by the United States and its Western allies. And that is the space that Israel has got. And from where I stand, I think Israelis prima facie, for the time being, in the near future, have got more points than even Turkey.
I think that certainly when we're looking at what country is trying to take the most advantage and what country is also just receiving the most points and the most advantages, from this recent development, I think that you're absolutely right in the sense that Turkey, in many ways, I think has benefited. They've now been able to carve out really a very clear pathway in the Northeast to try and commandeer that corridor that they've long sought after. And I think for Israel as well, I think that for Israel, we've seen not only the influx of Iran-aligned militias back into Iraq and back into Iran, also the fall of the Assad regime, but also very favorable conditions in which now they can exploit and try and push beyond Golan and use that at least as leverage over this new governance structure, if not also trying to carve out their own sphere of influence inside of Syria that could serve as a contested territory or frozen lines in this conflict that they'd be able to really leverage to their advantage. And so I think because of that, I think there are two very clear winners here. Of course, for the last few days, Syrians have been extremely celebratory, jubilant, dancing in the streets because of the fall of the Assad regime. But I think the last 2 days, the mood has been a lot more somber because we're seeing what's happening in the Northeast. We're seeing what's happening with Israel pushing beyond the Golan. And then, of course, combined that now with the evidence that we're seeing come out of prisons and, within some of these regime-held areas about just the torture that took place under the Assad regime. And with all of that combined, I think the mood is a lot more measured, a lot more somber, because it's very clear that this new peace, this new governance structure could easily be threatened. And there are many wrenches that could be thrown into it. So this feeling of, Syria is finally ours, I think is something that is fading fast among Syrians in Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, you see, here's the problem with this situation. I was talking to a couple of friends, and it's about what value you want to assign to X or Y. Now, so if you were to use the framework of Bashar al-Assad's governance and focus on that, then obviously it was a terribly cruel dispensation. But if you were to assign a different value to Syria within the broader geopolitical framework, then you can see that the state actors and their non-state proxies have moved in Syria not to free Syria per se, but to do something completely different, and it could end up with the Balkanization of Syria. But Leila, one, of course, as I close the program, final word about the situation. And secondly, there is one other factor. In fact, I should take it back to Caroline also before I close, is Azerbaijan. And Turkey's, so if you look at the map once again, you get the buffer, and then you also, if you were checkmating Iran, then one of the areas where you do that, and we know that Azerbaijan has a very sizable presence of Mossad also. And as a matter of fact, Mossad has been operating inside Iran primarily from Azerbaijan. And then there is the Zengezur corridor, which Iran has always been concerned about. If Turkey manages to get that link up, there's going to be a further chokehold on Iran.
Well, Turkey already has a hold on that. They do have a partnership with the Azeri government, the Azerbaijani government. Remember, they take oil from Azerbaijan, bring it to the Israeli entity through Turkey. So at the end of the day, the Russian oil that goes to Azerbaijan and the Azerbaijani oil that comes from Azerbaijan goes to Turkey. From Turkey, it gets distributed. Part of it goes to Central Europe, and the other part is basically loaded on the tankers that are owned by Bilal Erdogan, the son of Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and then it's shipped to the Israeli entity. At the end of the day, what the Turks and the Azerbaijanis do together insinuates that they are in control of that situation. But it's still not checkmate for Iran. You have to remember, as much as they have operatives in Iran, Iran for the past at least 2 decades have planted its own operatives also elsewhere, including in the Israeli entity. This is how they managed to get information inside that gave an upper hand at one point in time to Hezbollah over the Israeli entity with their Hudhud plane. You remember, like they were selling their Hupo drone, and they were naming things on the ground that you cannot find on the map. If you actually use Google Map, it will not give you the names of and the use of these bases or what they do. So that insinuates that there's an operative on the ground, and be it somebody bought from the inside or somebody planted in the inside, that insinuates that at one point the axis of resistance was able to do so. Would the Yemenis be able to do it? I highly doubt, nor the Iraqis. Hezbollah on its own, possibly in some places, but that's definitely the work of a government and a state-supported intelligence apparatus, and that would be Iran in this case. Having said that, you have to remember one thing, and that's very important and critical. You spoke about the maritime siege on Latakia and Tartus, and basically, let's say all the way up to northern Syria, the northern maritime borders. That means a total siege on Lebanon as well. But what tells you that Hezbollah isn't actually manufacturing weapons inside Lebanon? And at the same time, yes, they will have a finite source of weapons going forward. At the end of the day, they cannot manufacture everything. But at the same time, they have hedged for 18 years for a long war of attrition. We saw it in 8 years in Lebanon between 1992 and 2000. They were using their weapons very wisely, that it lasted them for 8 years. And after 2006, I think they learned their lesson. The only problem with the whole thing is that Hezbollah is not totally damaged. It is crippled in certain areas. As you said, they are still in South Lebanon because they are part of the South. They recently hit the Israeli entity in the occupied Lebanese Kfar Hills with 2 missiles, or 4, actually it was 4 missiles, against their Waysat al-Alam IOF military post. And that was a warning because the Israelis were actually increasing their beaches to the cessation of hostilities understanding. So that means Hezbollah has not withdrawn. It hasn't put out its weapons from basically south of the Litani River. Because the Israelis continue to breach it, the Lebanese side doesn't have to stick to it. But again, at the end of the day, their weapons are not all in Syria. Not most of them are in South Lebanon. And at the same time, they do manufacture their own weapons. It's going to be a long war. What the Israelis are banking on is sending those terrorists to Lebanon. We have another wave of terrorist attacks inside Lebanon, suicide bombers, etc. This is how you weaken Hezbollah internally, is by attacking it from the backside, from the northern front, from the northern Lebanese borders. That's our closest borders to Syria from either side, be it north or east. And that basically means the back of Hezbollah is exposed. Hezbollah has to turn its back to the south or divide itself to be able to work on the ground, because we know for a fact that the Lebanese army cannot do it on its own, especially that the Lebanese army is not well armed. So how it's going to play forward, there will be an increased pressure on Iran from the international community with respect to its nuclear program. But at the same time, the Americans and the Israelis would be working on defanging and declawing Iran. Now they have done with they're done with it in the Levant. They'll move over to the GCC area and in Pakistan as well. You have to be careful over there. That's a very critical point for Iran. It's Pakistan. Pakistan is its backyard in terms of security. Whatever infiltrates over there, it's going to harm the Iranians. We saw it happen, and you actually had a whole show on it when there was a joint attack by the Iranian forces and the Pakistani forces on each other's land to hit rogue agents on the ground that cross the borders between each other, and they are supported by the Americans. So at the end of the day, there's going to be a major work against Iran. Iran is the end game for the Americans, and the Israelis know that, so they are trying to basically present Iran to them on a silver platter by eliminating the militias, as she said, the Iraqi militias who were operating in Syria, and the Lebanese resistance who was supporting Syria, and at the same time posing a threat to the Israelis along the northern Palestinian border, which is basically South Lebanon.
We now have, after that incident, unfortunate incident, we now have an agreement. And there are military observers on both sides. There's the Iranian observers on our side and the Pakistani observers on their side. So there is a lot of coordination in terms of targets and what can be attacked and what can't be attacked. But anyway, I mean, that was sorted out. But obviously, you're right. I mean, we have to be very wary of external actors who could always throw a wrench in. But Caroline, one, of course, I just want to get your view on what I asked Leila, but also very quickly with reference to, I mean, Leila doesn't think that there's going to be a US troop pullout, but you're quite sure that there's likely to be. So in the event that, there is a US troop pullout and Syria, kind of explodes once again, what are the options for the United States?
Certainly, this is a question that right now I'm really exploring deeply. We have a project over at the New Lines Institute that explores the impact of military withdrawal and the implications that follow. And I think that when we look at a potential U.S. withdrawal from the Northeast, I think it's very important to think about, for example, October and December 2019, right before 2020, when Trump, of course, announced that he would withdraw troops. And that decision was, of course, later reversed. And there were key elements within the administration that were committed to a U.S. presence and forces being stationed in Northeast Syria as well as Iraq. A lot of those voices are no longer going to be in administration, the incoming administration in January. And additionally, there are a number of voices that will be on Trump's cabinet that have advocated, and also some of them have a congressional record of voting for a quick and speedy withdrawal from Northeast Syria. I'm thinking of individuals like J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard. Initially, that list also included Matt Gaetz, although Matt Gaetz has now been removed from that role. He was actually someone who introduced introduced a bill on the House floor advocating for a very quick withdrawal from Syria. I imagine that when it comes to the debate around a U.S. withdrawal, it is going to really look like Rubio and Waltz versus everyone. And also, it's very clear that Trump himself personally is not necessarily a fan of U.S. forward presence in both Syria as well as Iraq. I think it's also important to think about how a incremental withdrawal process in Iraq is already paving the way for an incremental or speedy withdrawal process in Northeast Syria. Just a few months ago, in September, I think it was August or September, the United States announced that as a part of its bilateral security dialogue with Iraq, it was announcing a complete withdrawal process by the end of 2026. It did not specify how many forces would withdraw by the end of 2026, but it did say that it was transferring bases, equipments, and would essentially consolidate to Erbil, moving out of Baghdad. And then from Erbil, it would then start the complete withdrawal process. Likely there would be a contingent of U.S. advisors after 2026, but really it depends on how friendly the Sudani government would be to a contingent of U.S. forces staying. And I have doubts. What is important here, the Iraq side of the coin, is that a lot of these bases, the U.S. forces and the mission in Northeast Syria, they're heavily dependent on ISR, intelligence, reconnaissance, security support from these bases. They rely on personnel. These bases are also a backup plan if forces need to suddenly move into Iraq if they're under threat or duress. And so because of this, the withdrawal process in Iraq is likely going to pave the way for a withdrawal process in Northeast Syria, simply because they are highly dependent on that process and that presence, and will really struggle in terms of ISR support, logistical support, and supply lines with Iraq being cut off. So I think for Trump and his cabinet, they're going to see that withdrawal process as almost an excuse to draw down its forces in Northeast Syria, essentially say, all right, to Turkey, this is yours now in the Northeast. Do with it what you will. Maybe we'll provide some visas, special immigration visas for translators, fixers, and forces that fought alongside U.S. forces with the SDF. But beyond that, I don't necessarily see the U.S. staying in Northeast.
Well, we saw how it worked for the Afghans who fought alongside the Americans. So I don't think that's a very optimistic scenario. But frankly, Caroline, without prejudice to your argument, and you've said it yourself also, in terms of logistics and ISR and the rest of it, even if you're using over-the-horizon capabilities, because setting up bases is not like a toggle switch. You can switch it on and off. So there might be a drawdown, but I don't think I agree with Leila that I don't think that unless Trump is one of those Trumpian moods, I don't think that they're going to close down the bases, because that's an infrastructure that they would need in terms of any contingency or something. But it's always great to have both of you. Last time, when I was closing the program, I said that I suspect that we will be revisiting Syria. And for all the wrong reasons, I have been proven right. But thank you so much for your insights. And I must say that I suspect that this is not the end of it, and we might be seeing each other once again. But this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't get me any lucre, frankly, but it makes me very happy, and it also helps us bring you quality discussions. So until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.